We now come to the urgent questions. Shadow Secretary of State James Cartlidge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Defence if he will make a statement on his commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate the Shadow Defence Secretary on securing this first defence urgent question of the new Parliament. It is the case, in fact, that previous Defence Secretaries answered just 2 urgent questions in the whole of the last 5 years. And, Mr. Speaker, while I can't promise to answer every one of the future UQs, I wanted to come today with this first to underline just how seriously I take our department's responsibility to report to this House. Mr. Speaker, this government has a cast-iron commitment to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence. We promised this in our manifesto at the election. The Prime Minister promised it at NATO in Washington in July. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, promised this in the budget 2 weeks ago, as well as announcing a £3 billion boost for defence spending next year to start to fix the foundations for our armed forces. And this, of course, is on top of £3 billion each year for Ukraine. And I remind the House that, of course, the last time this country did spend 2.5% of GDP on defence was in 2010 with the last Labour government, a level not matched in any of the 14 Tory years since. Mr. Speaker, everyone agrees that defence spending must increase to match and deal with the threats that we face. And one of our very first acts as a government was to launch the Strategic Defence Review, which is working at pace to look at the threats we face, the capabilities we need and the resources we have available. Because, Mr. Speaker, this isn't just about how much we spend, but it is how we spend it too. And the Prime Minister said at NATO that our plan in the SDR will come first, then we will set out the pathway to spending 2.5%. And the Chief Secretary to the Treasury said yesterday this will come in the spring. Mr. Speaker, today is Armistice Day. Earlier at the 11th hour, I had the honour of laying a wreath at the cenotaph. And today is a reminder of what's at stake in this new era of insecurity, a reminder that our dedicated servicemen and women around the clock, around the world, work to keep us safe, and a reminder of the ultimate sacrifice that so many have made in the past so that we may live in freedom today. We will remember them.
James Cartlidge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for granting this urgent question, especially on Armistice Day. I'll just say to the Secretary of State, I'm very grateful for his response, but he keeps going back to 2010, and when we spent 2.5%, it's true, but without adding the fact that they had bankrupted the country. And in fact, I asked the House of Commons Library about this. The IFS confirmed that had they returned to government, they were planning cuts to the defence budget of 20 to 25%, Mr. Speaker. But this question is about today, when the threat picture is now far graver than for many generations, as confirmed by CDS at the weekend. Now, as the Secretary of State said, the Labour Party committed in its General Election Manifesto to a path to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence, and the Prime Minister said shortly after taking office it was cast iron, as the Secretary of State repeated today. And with President Trump's election victory, there will inevitably be a greater focus on what more European NATO members can do to boost Europe's own defence. But yesterday, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and this morning the Secretary of State himself were unable to say whether the government would deliver on 2.5% in the current Parliament. In addition, yesterday the Sunday Times reported that DNS in Abbey Wood have effectively been instructed to avoid any new procurement at all for the rest of this financial year. Mr. Speaker, 2.5% is not an end in itself. The key reason in April we set out a fully funded multi-year pathway to 2.5% was to enable the MOD to procure at pace and at scale the munitions we need to urgently replenish our stocks to war-fighting levels. With the whole world wanting to buy more munitions, we cannot afford to delay any further. But I have key questions for the Secretary of State, because at the same time we're having this debate, sir, there are a whole load of new burdens coming for the MOD which they will have to cover. So can the Secretary of State answer the following? In which financial year does he expect the share of GDP spent on defence to start rising significantly? And will he guarantee to hit 2.5% this Parliament, yes or no? Now, not including existing programmes, is it true that there is a freeze on new procurement of DNS for the rest of this financial year? Will the MOD be 100% compensated by the Treasury for higher employer national insurance contributions and for the cost of increasing CEA? And will service families be 100% compensated for the extra VAT on school fees? Penultimately, sir, on Armistice Day, can the Secretary of State absolutely rule out surviving spouses of service personnel being taxed on death-in-service benefits? And finally, on the Chagos Islands, in the Department's written answer to me, they refuse to say how much the MOD will contribute to renting back our own military base. So it's a very simple question. He won't tell us how much it's going to cost. Can he tell us, does he know how much it's going to cost?
Well done. That's a good say. In granting the urgent question, we are limited to how much time each person has. We can remember that. 2 minutes for the main opposition, 1 minute for the other opposition. Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, 14 years his Conservative government had to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, and it wasn't a plan or a pathway from the last government, as the Shadow Defence Secretary tries to claim. It was a political ploy. It was announced 4 weeks before they then called the general election. It was unfunded. It was a con on the armed forces and on the British people, who gave their answer emphatically by sweeping away Tory MPs in many of the proudest military communities and constituencies across the country. Mr Speaker, on his accusations about a total spending freeze, we are putting in place, and I am putting in place, a grip on out-of-control spending that the last government left. We're securing value for money, we're cutting waste, and we're getting a grip of defence spending in a way that his government did not. On the continuous education allowance, we greatly value this allowance. We greatly recognise the role it plays in helping avoid the disruption of children's education of serving personnel. And in line with how the allowance operates already, we will continue to pay up to 90% of private school fees following the VAT increase in January. So by uprating the cap, we take account of any increase in spending. And on the Chagos Islands, of course I know the details because I was heavily involved in the negotiations. This secures Britain's military base. It secures a military base for our US allies, which is why they welcomed it so strongly. And I've said to the Shadow Secretary, and I've said to this House, when it debates the treaty, will have that full information. And nobody, Mr Speaker, knows better the defence inheritance that 14 years of the Conservative government have left in the last 4 months than the Shadow Defence Secretary. He was the Defence Minister at the heart of the problems, with billion-pound black holes, service morale at record lows, a crisis in recruitment and retention of personnel. Never again must a government leave our armed forces in a worse state than when they found them. And this is a government that will make this country more secure at home and strong abroad.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tanmanjeet Singh, Dhesi.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Speaker, we live in an increasingly dangerous and volatile world with hundreds of thousands of people dying or being injured within our own continent in Ukraine, wars raging, conflicts raging in the Middle East, Africa and beyond, not to mention the increased nefarious activity in the grey zone. So without a shadow of a doubt, we are dealing with exceptional circumstances and we need to actually grasp the gravity of the situation. I have a great deal of time and respect for the Secretary of State because I know he gets it. But my question is, do others in government understand the gravity of the situation? Because we need clarity, we need a timetable so that not only our allies know where we are heading, but also those within our defence community.
Yes, Mr Speaker, they do. Everyone agrees that defence spending must increase. It is increasing. It's increasing with this government, and it increased in the first budget of this new government by nearly £3 billion for next year. And alongside that is the cast-iron commitment that this is a government that will set a path to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We're deeply concerned about the impact of the US elections on Ukraine and Europe. President Trump is an unreliable partner, and within days of his election, the US's support to Ukraine is regrettably now under question. Clearly, the UK needs to urgently set out a spending path to 2.5% of GDP on defence. We now need to lead in Europe. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the legacy of the previous government of our army, which is the smallest since the Napoleonic era, is deeply regrettable? And will the Minister commit to securing a UK EU-wide defence and security agreement, as was on the table while Theresa May was Prime Minister? And will the government convene a Save Ukraine summit to begin the process of seizure of frozen Russian assets so that the UK and our European allies can support Ukraine regardless of the path that the US takes?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, we don't need a summit in order to release the interest on the frozen assets of corrupt Russian money. We're doing that already. The Chancellor and I are working very closely on that and have announced that from early next year, 2.3 billion will be available for Ukraine for that purpose. I can give the Honourable Lady the assurance that we will pursue a UK-EU security pact alongside the deep bilateral agreements that we've already started to strike last month with Germany, with the most comprehensive defence agreement that this country has signed in many years. And finally, Mr. Speaker, she is right. She is right to say, as I have argued before, that at a time of increasing global threats, European nations in NATO must do more of the heavy lifting. We must be prepared to spend more on defence, but we must also be prepared to work together to increase the level of deterrence that we can offer to those who would do us harm.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wasn't President Trump right in his first term when he pushed NATO countries to increase defence spending? And we see those numbers have gone from 6 countries back in 2021 to 23 countries meeting the 2% target now. And isn't this so serious? Because if in President Trump's second term, he makes decisions on Ukraine, we may be faced with a choice that we either accept those decisions or we step up and protect Europe's defence ourselves.
Well, like my honourable friend, I welcome the fact that 23 NATO nations this year will hit the 2% spend. I regard that as a floor, not a ceiling, and the UK, under both governments, has always spent well above and set the pace for other European countries. We will continue to do that. We'll continue to do that because European countries in NATO must take on more of the NATO leadership, and we are determined that the UK will do that. That's why we said our approach to defence will be a NATO first policy, and that we will, wherever we can, look to be first in NATO so that we set the pace on the sort of transformation and better equipped and better able and more lethal forces that our nations need to deter adversaries and defend ourselves if we're required.
Sir Julian.
Secretary of State is absolutely right that we used to spend a lot more than 2%. In the 1980s, it was between 4.5% and 5.1% of GDP on defence. But does he share my concern at what I heard on the radio this morning, which was a Labour politician in another place saying that he could see an outcome in Ukraine whereby Russia gets to keep the territory it's occupied, and Ukraine does not get any guarantee of joining NATO, but merely some more security assurances. And we know what happened last time with the security assurances previously given. Right. So does he agree with me that it's very important whether we spend 2.5% on defence now or in the near future, that whoever we send to Washington doesn't capitulate in advance?
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman, I think implicit in his question, makes an important point that it is the Ukrainians that are fighting. It is the Ukrainians that will make the call about whether to talk and on what terms. And our task, as one of the leading supporters of Ukraine in its fight for sovereignty and freedom and its own future, is to support it and step up our support for its fight, and then step up our support, if necessary and whenever is required in any negotiations, and to play our part, as we have made the commitment to do in providing any security guarantees for the longer term as well.
Mary Rimmer.
Mr. Speaker, Russia has gone into war in Europe, starting in Ukraine. It was America and Britain who saved Europe the last war, and that looks to be the same. Europe simply must step up. But can the Secretary of State tell us what discussions he's had with Lloyd Webber about America's role in the way forward now?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, to be quite honest with my honourable friend, it's a little early to have discussions with America. It's less than a week since the presidential elections. The current administration has more than 2 months to go. As she would expect, I'm in detailed discussions with the current administration and my counterpart there, in particular about how we together, as two of Ukraine's leading allies, can step up our support over the couple of months ahead. But in the future, I expect a President Trump-led administration to recognise that it is in America's interests, it's in NATO's interests, it's in the interest of all countries that believe in the international rules-based order and a stable and secure peace that Putin does not prevail. Because if large countries like Russia are able to redraw international boundaries by force, then that sends a signal that undermines the security of all nations. And if reports are right that President Trump has already spoken with President Putin and warned him against the escalation that we see from Russia in Ukraine, this is a very good first step and an early sign.
Ian Duncan Smith. Sir Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman knows I have the highest respect for him. We've clashed occasionally across the floor, but I ask him this very simple question. In China today, one shipyard building naval vessels now is outbuilding the whole of the United States naval capability. One shipyard, and they have many hundreds. So given that and the threat from Russia, Iran and this totalitarian state axis, could he tell me now, if Lord Robertson comes back and spells out exactly what I believe he will do, which is the biggest threat we've faced since the Cold War, will he tell the Prime Minister, I say not ask, but tell the Prime Minister, number one responsibility, defence of the realm, 2.5% now.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister does not need me to tell him that the duty and the first duty of any government and this government is to defend the country and keep our citizens safe. And he will not need me because he commissioned the Strategic Defence Review. My job is to oversee it successfully. He will not need any persuading of the arguments and the assessments of the threats and some of the capability recommendations that Strategic Defence Review, externally led by Lord Robertson, is likely to produce.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend is absolutely right not to give a scintilla of credibility to the idea that the party opposite, having spent 14 years never reaching 2.5%, were going to do it if only they'd had one more chance. But he is also right to say that what is important is not just identifying more money for defence spending, but also to make sure we start spending it better. So can he say any more about what he is now doing to ensure that the huge wastage that we've seen in defence procurement under the party opposite is brought into hand under his stewardship?
I'm almost tempted, Mr. Speaker, to encourage the Shadow Defence Secretary to answer that question because he was Minister for Defence Procurement up until 4 months ago, and so he's principally responsible, for instance, for the fact that only 2 out of 49 largest defence projects are on time and on budget. He has failed to fix what the Public Accounts Committee of this House, an all-party committee, has termed the broken procurement system that has been failing our forces and failing British taxpayers. So this is a deep task of reform. It's not a glamorous task, but it is one that I have made one of my first priorities as Defence Secretary.
Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the UK able to provide an armoured division to NATO on an enduring basis?
Mr. Speaker, the armed forces will always respond to the requirements placed on them, and we will always seek to fulfil our NATO obligations. It's one of the reasons that I conducted in the first 100 days a NATO test, because I was concerned that part of the failures of the last 14 years had led to us falling short. And, Mr. Speaker, that's part of the inheritance that we take on as a new government, and my determination as the Defence Secretary is now that we make our forces better fit to fight, better able to deter, and better able to play a leading part in NATO as it steps up the level of deterrence and our level of defence across the 32 nations.
Joanna Baxter.
Mr. Speaker, today on Armistice Day we honour those who have served, those who have fought and those who have made the ultimate sacrifice to protect the freedoms we enjoy. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that today and every day we must remember everything our armed forces are doing to keep us safe, and will he agree to come to my constituency to meet with Sight Scotland veterans, an incredible charity providing amazing support to all our visually impaired veterans?
Mr. Speaker, at the risk of upsetting my diary secretary, I would welcome the opportunity to visit my honourable friend and her constituency with her veterans group there. But she is right, and today of all days, we remember not just those who gave their lives for the way of life we enjoy today, but the serving personnel, men and women of our armed forces around the world. We currently have 10,000 personnel on operations in 50 different countries around the world, and this is a reminder of the work they do day in, day out to keep us all safe.
Sir Bernard.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, can I assure the Secretary of State that those of us who have followed the defence debate over the last 10, 20 or even 30 years know that he takes these matters extremely seriously and understands the scale of the challenge that we face. And in that vein, can I encourage him that we start telling the truth, that we're going to have to spend far more than 2.5% of GDP on defence within quite a short number of years, with a former Chief of General Staff warning that this country might be directly at war within the lifetime of this Parliament. Can I suggest that he use his friends across this House to influence both his government and the Treasury influences on our own side, that we're going to have to bust a gut for a major rearmament programme that we've not seen in this country since the 1930s.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman has been consistent in those arguments that he's made. I welcome his contribution this afternoon. I know the Treasury will have noted that. They'll probably take it as an early representation for the next budget. In the meantime, I will ensure that the Strategic Defence Review starts from the point of the threats that we face, war in Europe, conflict in the Middle East, growing threats globally, as well as Russian aggression more widely and beyond Ukraine. We will ensure that we are able to match the capabilities we develop with the threats that we face, and we will do so within the resources we have available.
Tim Rocker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend for Chesterfield raised an important point. The new government inherited £167 billion worth of projects, none of which were rated green by the National Audit Office. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that more money is one part of the equation, but spending it well is the other part?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. It's one of the reasons that the Prime Minister, early doors in Washington, not only reaffirmed our ironclad commitment to increasing defence spending to 2.5%, but said the Strategic Defence Review comes first, and then that pathway to 2.5%. That is exactly so that we can ensure that we increase what we spend, but we spend it better.
Dame Caroline Downage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In 2023, I asked his colleague, who's now the Education Secretary, how their plans for VAT on school fees would impact continuity of education allowance and forces families. And I was told, and I quote, "She need not be concerned about what we are discussing today." Mr. Speaker, it's 2 years on. VAT on school fees goes live in January. and details of the rates of continuity of education allowance still haven't been articulated to the forces families in my constituency. Mr. Speaker, as the proud MP for a military constituency, I can tell him I am concerned. My constituents are concerned. What's the plan to better communicate with them?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry that our confirmation of the steps we're taking from January has not reached her, and I'll ensure that they are. It will be an uprating in the continuity of education allowance. It will ensure that our armed forces that take advantage of this allowance will be able to get up to 90% of the school fees that they have to pay covered by that allowance, and that takes into account any rise in school fees as a result of the VAT being levied.
Andrew Lewin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Shadow Secretary of State referenced his so-called plan for defence spending back in April this year, a plan that the Institute for Government said did not add up and was fictitious. Will my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, agree with me that under this Labour government we will never make funding commitments to our armed forces unless they are fully funded?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I can, and my honourable friend is right. The Institute for Fiscal Studies described that so-called plan, the election pitch 4 weeks before they called the election, as misleading and an empty promise. And I give this House the undertaking that the plans that we put in place will be openly discussed in this House, and we will ensure that we can match the resources available to our plans.
Graham Lebby, Bitter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Defence professionals across Whitehall will have their heads in their hands at this government's commitment to 2.5% sometime and when fiscal conditions permit. To fail to commit in defence investment with the multiple security threats impacting us from the Ukraine war to the Middle East and a plethora of global cyber threats is strategically illiterate. These threats won't wait for the Chancellor to get grip, so what urgent steps will the Secretary of State take with the Chancellor to ensure at least the 2.5% promised by the Labour Party on defence is spent when the threat assessment demands it, which is now, and not when the Chancellor feels it to be convenient?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to take what I can from the honourable gentleman, which is an SNP welcome and urging for increasing defence spending. That will happen. That will happen under a Labour government, and the Scottish workforce, the Scottish military, the Scottish-based military will play an important part in the defence of this country in the future.
Kevin Bonasia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard some chutzpah from the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence today. 14 years they've had to get to 2.5%, and yet they demand it from us now. I'm very pleased that the Secretary of State has set out how we will get towards 2.5% after our strategic defence review. But in the meantime, we have to clear up the mess that the last government left behind. Can the Secretary of State assure the House that he and his colleagues are working to clear up the waste and mismanagement that they have found when they've come to the MOD?
I can indeed, Mr. Speaker, and it was one of my predecessors as Defence Secretary that admitted to this House that under 14 years of the last governments, the armed forces have been hollowed out and underfunded. And it's no surprise when you look at the record of the Conservative government when they came into office in 2010 compared to ours. Our first budget, a £3 billion boost to defence. Their first budget, a £2 billion real terms cut. Our manifesto, a commitment to increase defence spending to 2.5%. Their first 5 years in government, an 18% real cut in defence spending. It laid the foundations for the degradation and the poor state of our armed forces and the poor state of the finances that we've now inherited.
The last government extended to state school pupils the undoubted advantage of the combined cadet forces, which had been the almost exclusive prerogative of private school students. Why then?
If he'd look at me when he's asking the question.
Why then, Mr. Speaker, has this government decided, last week of all weeks, to defund CCFs and thus remove the advantages that state school pupils are now enjoying as a result of decisions taken by the last government.
Mr. Speaker, I simply don't recognise his description of any decisions that we've taken, and it would run contrary to what he and I both agree is the value of combined cadet forces. And most of us in our constituencies have contact and working relations with good cadet forces that give young people opportunities they simply wouldn't get at school in any other walk of life. They have an important part to play in the future of individuals and also in the wider understanding of our armed forces.
Ragor Poynton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the recent announcement from the Secretary of State from the Armed Forces Commissioner Bill as a promise made and a promise being kept. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that this is just one part of the puzzle of showing that we can support our troops as they work to keep us safe?
Yeah. Indeed, I do, Mr. Speaker. And my honourable friend is a strong champion locally in his constituency in Scotland for the cause of the armed forces and the veterans. And I greatly valued the visit I was able to do with him before the election to talk with veterans in his constituency and talk about the plans that we have for increasing the support on employment, on mental health, on housing for the future.
Suella Bradman.
Mr. Speaker, one of the big achievements of the last 14 years was the delivery of the aircraft carriers. Both of them are stationed in nearby Portsmouth to my constituency. But, Mr. Speaker, it does remain clear that they are underpowered. We need more Type 45s, more Type 26s, more Type 81s. If the government is serious about 2.5%, when will it set out its plan to invest in our Royal Navy and in particular in our aircraft carriers so that our carrier strike group provides a world-class capability?
Well, the aircraft carriers are an important defence programme. We're considering the threats we face, the future capabilities we need. We're doing that as part of the Strategic Defence Review that will report in the spring, and we'll follow that with then our clear path and our commitment to 2.5% of GDP on defence, just as the Chief Secretary told the media over the weekend yesterday.
Bid Swallow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is Armistice Day, an important moment to pause and remember the huge amount that our armed forces have done to keep us safe. On this day, does the Secretary of State agree with me that not only must we set out our ironclad commitment to 2.5%, but also support the armed forces, their families and our veterans?
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, and in many ways it's the forces' families that support those who put on the uniform that are too often overlooked. It's one of the reasons why when we introduced the legislation last week, as we promised to do at the election, for an independent Armed Forces Commissioner, this is a post that will report directly to Parliament, will have access to personnel, to sites, to information, to be able to look into the concerns not just of those who serve, but the families that support them in order to improve service life for the future.
John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I commend to the Secretary of State the role of ploughshare, which is used to deal with the increasing commercialisation of opportunities at DSTL at Porton Down in my constituency. And in the context of the holistic review that's underway by his department, would he undertake to ensure that that organisation is not held back in extending the opportunities that it can to commercialise assets coming out of MOD research?
Well, one of the weaknesses in our system is that the often excellent innovation and research and development does not get developed, does not get invested in, and does not get commercialised, so that potentially brilliant small companies don't grow and expand. I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, I'm not familiar with Planshare. Ploughshare. I didn't even hear the name correctly. If the right honourable gentleman would like to write to me with some details, I'd welcome his letter and I'll certainly have a look.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Like others on this side of the House, I welcome the increase in defence spending announced in the budget after years of Tory cuts to our armed forces. Does the Secretary of State agree with me on the need to increase defence spending in response to the merging of threats around the world, from Ukraine to the Middle East and Asia Pacific, and that even this figure should be kept under review in the light of changing events around the world?
Yes, indeed, Mr Speaker, I do, and my honourable friend makes the important point that the starting point for any defence planning must be the threats that we face, and the heart of any defence plans must be the people who serve and on who we depend. And I make that point particularly forcefully and heartfelt on this today, Armistice Day.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In 2021, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, defence spending was 2.3% of GDP. In 2022, following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, defence spending in the UK was 2.3% of GDP. Now that we have an isolationist president-elect about to go into the White House, defence spending is 2.3% of GDP. When will defence spending rise beyond 2.3% of GDP?
I'm not sure that I heard the honourable gentleman welcome the fact that this is a government that has made a commitment to set a path to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, a level that we've not had in this country for the last 14 years. An increase in defence spending that everyone agrees is needed, and it's needed in order to deal with precisely the increasing threats that he cites.
Mark Seawood.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I welcome the opposition's newfound enthusiasm for meeting the 2.5% defence spending target, especially since after 14 years they weren't able to even meet it once. And I would gently remind them that the last party in decades to meet that target was the Labour Party. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that not only do we need to increase our spending to 2.5% of GDP, but we must also remain steadfast in our support of the people of Ukraine to protect the entire continent of Europe?
I do indeed agree with my honourable friend, Mr Speaker. I pay tribute to the last government and the way that they ensured that the UK led in support for Ukraine. We've been determined as a new government over these 4 months to continue that. We've stepped up the military aid we're supplying to Ukraine. We've speeded up that support in a way that President Zelensky now cites as a model to other countries, and we are now spending more on military aid to Ukraine than ever before. £3 billion this year, next year, and every year for as long as it takes, plus the £2.3 billion that we'll be able to release in the frozen assets seized from the corrupt regime of Putin's Russia.
That's objective.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I will urge the Secretary of State to exercise a little bit of caution when referring to defence spending under the last Labour government. As someone who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and used some of the kit and equipment that was issued then, there were some serious concerns at the time, particularly around things like Snatch Land Rover, and I spent a lot of time driving around Basra in one of those. A lot of people lost their lives in those vehicles, so I would exercise a little caution and restraint there. But my question is on a different topic. Regarding CEA, how much will meeting the additional cost of VAT cost the MOD from its own budget?
Mr Speaker, we will publish the financial figures for the CEA in due course in the normal way, and I just would say also on the honourable gentleman's previous point, I'm very conscious of what he and those who served in Afghanistan and Iraq faced. I'm very conscious of that at times during the Labour government, as in any government, you find the kit and equipment lacking. It's why we tried to replace those vehicles using urgent operational requirements at the time. And I'd just say to the honourable gentleman, whilst inevitably we fell short in some areas, it was nevertheless the case, not only that in 2010 when we were last in government, that we were spending 2.5% of GDP on defence, the strength of the full-time British Army was over 100,000 soldiers.
Slinger.
Mr Speaker,
Can I associate myself with comments of honourable and right honourable members about Armistice Day? During the previous government, the size of our armed forces shrank from 192,000 to 138,000, a 28% decrease. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that it will take this Labour government to put our defences back on the firm footing that we need for an increasingly dangerous world after many years of underinvestment?
Well, my honourable friend is right that he's pointing to armed forces numbers. He's pointing to the heart of a deep, long-run problem, a crisis in recruitment and retention for our forces. Recruitment targets set every year for 14 years and missed every year for 14 years. Steps that we are starting to deal with. The largest pay rise for our armed forces for over 20 years, so that I can now stand here as the first Defence Secretary to be able to say all of those in uniform are now being paid at least the national living wage. And Mr. Speaker, the introduction of an independent Armed Forces Commissioner to improve service life will start to reset the nation's contract with those who serve and the families that support them.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, last year global arms expenditure reached 2.4 trillion, the highest level since the end of the Cold War. And UK arms expenditure went up and is no doubt going to go up a lot more because of the statement made today by the Secretary of State. He quite rightly mentioned the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in Gaza. He didn't mention Sudan, but he may well have done, thinking about it. What actions are being taken by him and by his government to try to bring about a cessation of these conflicts, a cessation of the global tension, in order to globally be able to reduce defence expenditure so some of that money can be used to deal with the serious environmental and inequality issues that face this planet?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we can't wish away the threats, we can't wish away the conflicts, which is why it beholds any government to ensure that we have the armed forces that are capable and equipped to deter those who would do us harm. On the question of conflicts, our support for Ukraine is steadfast. That conflict could be ended today if Putin withdrew from his illegal invasion of that sovereign country. And on the Middle East, we have argued and we have worked in opposition and continue to do in government for a ceasefire in Gaza that would allow the immediate release of all hostages and also the necessary flooding of humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians. A first step towards a political process that must be directed towards a two-state solution, which is the only guarantee of long-term peace and security in that region.
Mr. Strapper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had the privilege of starting my day just up the road from Chicksands Base in my constituency, with the community in Shefford marking Armistice Day with local veterans and the wider community.
Hear, hear.
In that light, I really welcome today's commitment to make sure we finally have a credible plan to get to 2.5% on spending on GDP on defence. But as the Secretary of State sets out, it's not just what we spend, but how we spend it. The last government spent millions on armed forces accommodation, but all too often left forces in my constituency in shocking situations. Will this government be different in making sure that our local armed services can finally access the quality of accommodation they deserve in local bases?
Hear, hear, hear.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right. Time and again in the surveys of armed forces personnel, poor quality housing, which would be intolerable in civilian life, is cited as a reason for low morale and an intention to leave the forces early. This is an underlying problem that we will fix. We won't be able to do that overnight, but we're determined that we will provide the accommodation and the housing that our heroes in uniform have a right to expect.
David Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I completely agree with the Defence Secretary that defence spending must increase to meet the threats that we face. The threats are visible and they're increasing. Now, given these threats, I found myself nodding in agreement with Admiral Lord West's recent Guardian article, which states that we should be bold and move directly to 3% of GDP for defence. So, does the Defence Secretary agree with his revered Labour colleague's assertion? And if not, why not?
Mr. Speaker, we've increased in our first budget defence spending by nearly £3 billion for next year. We have a cast-iron commitment to increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, a level that for the last 14 years under governments of his party has simply never been matched.
Martin Wrigley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State quite rightly refers to R&D spending and small firms, yet small firms in my constituency are telling me that spending has dried up. Can he assure me that this is just a blip and normal flow will be resumed as soon as possible?
Mr. Speaker, and I think the Shadow Secretary of State would agree with this. One of the necessary reforms of the system that we run in this country for procurement in an era in which innovation and technological development will become increasingly at a premium means that we have to be able to do much more to support the small and innovative firms, perhaps some in his constituency, and we have to reform our procurement system to ensure that that happens, and we will.
Jim Shea.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for his answers to all of the questions. Secretary of State, I would seek an assurance that our spending will focus not simply on cybersecurity, which is obviously essential, but also on recruitment and retention. And it must take into account that in April 2024, the Army fell below its target size for the first time since it was set, meaning that all 3 service branches are currently below target. The Army by 1%, the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines by 5%, the RAF by 10%. Overall, the UK Armed Forces were 5,440 personnel, 1% below target. We need an assurance, Mr. Speaker, on recruitment. Thank you so much.
Well, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and the Right Honourable Gentleman sets out some of the detailed dimensions of the crisis that we have in recruitment and retention. We will start to turn that round. We won't be able to do that straight away. We've made a start with the proper pay awards this year, fully funded for our armed forces. We're making a start with new legislation to set up an Armed Forces Commissioner to improve service life, and we'll take further steps in order to renew the nation's contract and the support that we can offer those who serve and the families who support them.
Point of order. Is it on this related question?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're grateful for your guidance. You know how strongly the House feels about the issue of the Chagos Islands and the decision reached by the government. You'll have heard today the Secretary was very clear the government do know what the cost will be to the Ministry of Defence in respect of that settlement. Now, we have asked repeatedly, oral questions, written questions, many colleagues, what the cost will be. That is public money. Can you advise me, given they refuse to tell us what that cost is, how else we can probe to find out how much that public money will be used?
Yeah. Certainly been put on the record again, and I'm sure the Secretary of State is listening very carefully. He may wish to respond, he may not. Maybe he doesn't. And in which case, I hope the Treasury bench, and I'm quite sure the Shadow Secretary of State won't give up at this stage. He'll find many ways that he will seek that information, and I'm sure at some point it will be forthcoming. But I'm sure he'll continue to ask the question.